Well, hi, and welcome back to another true crime episode. It's nice to see you, and I'm so glad that you've decided to join me today. So, I've been doing some soul searching, and I've realized that one of the things that's most difficult about sitting down to film a video for me is doing an intro. So, I've decided not to do one. It's a true crime video. You clicked on it, you already know what it is. So, let's roll the disclaimer. As you could already tell from the title of this video, we've got some nasty husband business going on today. Real quick, I do want to tell you I've been sick, so if my voice sounds weird or if I sound congested, that's why, and I hope that it's not too distracting for you. I also hope that my bruised looking eye makeup isn't too crazy. I was trying to match my eye makeup to my nails, and I ended up kind of getting this Ursula thing going on. I decided to lean into it and just try to bring out my inner sea witch. Honestly, I think it's kind of a vibe. All right, let's get right into today's story. So in 1999, things were looking pretty good for Toni Bertolet. After graduating summa cum laude from the University of Mississippi Medical School, she went on to start her career as a doctor of ophthalmology. By 1999, she had 2 private practices and was doing incredibly well for herself. She was a beautiful, successful, and educated woman. In fact, pretty much everyone in her family was successful. Her parents had invested heavily in land that was rich with oil, so they were loaded. And her older brother was also a doctor, a cardiologist. So he was a pretty smart cookie too. When she was younger, she did marry her college boyfriend, but that marriage unfortunately did not last. And this seemed to be the only place that Toni had ever failed in her life, really. But lucky for her, this was the year of love. She had just met the man of her dreams on a Christian dating website. I'm not actually sure which Christian dating site it was, but I know that it wasn't Christian Mingle, which is immediately the one that I thought of. The man who had swept her off her feet was Harold Henthorn, a wealthy entrepreneur who owned a business fundraising for mostly churches, but sometimes schools and hospitals as well. And Toni just thought that he was handsome and well put together, educated and intelligent, that he overall was just a really good match for her. And the best thing about Harold is that he really wanted to be a dad. He was 44 years old and still childless, just like Toni. This was very important to her because she was 37 years old at this point, and she desperately wanted to have a child. She had to this point dedicated her entire life to school and her career, but what she really, really wanted was to be a mom. She felt that biological clock ticking, and she did feel like time was running out for her. Now, she made a good living. As you can imagine, a specialist doctor with 2 private practices, she was not poor. But Harold assured her that the amount of money she made was insignificant compared to the amount of money he made, and that when they got together, she was never going to have to work again. She could devote her entire life to being a wife and a mom. That's really what she was looking to do at this point. So she thought that arrangement sounded pretty good. In fact, she was so excited by this prospect of a new life that she agreed to Harold's marriage proposal literally weeks after they met. And on September 30th, 2000, just 9 months after they met, they got married in Toni's home state of Mississippi. Immediately after getting married, Harold started making plans for them to relocate to Colorado, which is where he was from, and where he said he needed to conduct his business. Now, mind you, he worked from home when he wasn't traveling to do this fundraising. It did seem a little silly that Toni should have to leave behind her ophthalmology practice. I don't know why I pronounced that word so weird. Ophthalmology practice and her family and all of her friends to move to Denver. But Harold insisted that he needed to be conducting his business in Denver. And ultimately, it didn't really matter to Toni. She was gonna, have a kid and be a stay-at-home mom. So she'd be giving up her practices soon anyway. So she sold the practices and relocated to Denver. And she wanted to start trying for a baby right away. She was 37, which is not at all too late to have a baby. But when your first pregnancy comes and you're in your late 30s, there are some risks involved that are different than when you're like in your early 30s or your 20s. So she was ready to get started. It did take them 5 years, but finally in 2005, they welcomed a precious baby girl, and their family was complete. On the outside, Harold and Toni looked like a great, happy, loving couple. But that's how these stories always go. But those who were closest to them painted a little bit of a different picture. For most outside observers, the red flags were flying. For starters, I already mentioned one. He separated her from her entire support system. This is usually never a good sign. He was also incredibly controlling. Her family noticed right away that Harold needed to control every tiny aspect of their wedding. Like micromanaging doesn't even begin to cut it. Now, this is a little weird. I don't know how it is other places, but in American culture, generally speaking, the men aren't that involved with the wedding planning. That is changing. But remember, this guy is 44 years old when he gets married, and that's in 2000. So he definitely falls into that age group of men that would not traditionally care that much about the decorations and the music and all of those things. But Harold did. He basically did not let Toni make a single decision about how their wedding day went. He decided on the food, the decor, the music. And on top of all of that, Toni had 2 brothers, and he made them ushers for the wedding, not groomsmen. Now that is seriously breaking wedding etiquette. When the bride has male siblings, they are supposed to be part of the groom's party. That's just how it's done. But not at Harold's wedding. At Harold's wedding, they were seating the guests. Once they were relocated to Denver, he basically never allowed Toni to talk to her parents or any of her family in private. If any of them called, he was always the one to answer the phone. And if they wanted to talk to Toni, he would just put the phone on speaker so she could talk to them and he could overhear the entire conversation. When he wasn't traveling for work, he was working from home, so he was there most of the time. If they called and Toni wasn't home, he would take a message, but he wouldn't give that message to Toni. So she went for long periods of time thinking that her family just wasn't trying to get a hold of her. When their daughter was born, and just side note, I'm not going to be saying the daughter's name. I know it, and it's online, but this girl would be about 16, 17 years old now. She's trying to live a normal life, and she deserves to have that. So although it is out there, it's not protected information, I just personally don't want to be a part of having that information out in the world. So I won't be saying her name throughout this video, just so you're aware. Anyway, when their daughter was born, Harold took over every aspect of raising her. Remember how Harold promised Toni she'd never have to work again because he made so much money that she could just devote her time to being a wife and mother? Well, that didn't work out so well. Contrary to being able to not work anymore, Dr. Toni took a job at a local ophthalmologist's office, and once their daughter was born, ended up working more hours, not fewer. So while she was at work, Harold was doing all the being a dad. And even once Toni got home, she didn't get to spend that much time with her daughter. Harold insisted that about an hour before bedtime was their daddy-daughter time, and Toni was not allowed to see her at all. Harold picked out all of her clothes, decided what she ate and when she ate, set up all of her play dates with other kids, everything. Toni's dream of being a stay-at-home mom was non-existent. Harold simply did not allow for it. Harold Henthorn once bragged to Toni's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Bertolet, that he adored their daughter and he was going to buy her a $1 million home. But despite his success and the high salary he commanded, the Bertolets gave them the money for the down payment on their home. They also bought them cars and other gifts, something to the tune of $500,000. Her parents had the money to give, and they were generous. They wanted to set their children up with whatever they needed, but they shouldn't have had to. Harold let it be well known that he made a great deal more than Tony did. They should have been set up. So with all of this going on, even though Tony's family had been so happy and excited for her to finally get what she really wanted and deserved, they were getting pretty disenchanted with her husband, who was not exactly what he presented himself to be. And they became more and more upset as they saw Tony change from a bright, energetic, driven, independent woman into somebody they didn't recognize. Submissive and sad, with none of that spark she used to have. Tony's co-workers at the eye doctor office she worked at also sensed that something was a little off with Mr. Henthorn. Number one was that he always wanted to sit in on their staff meetings. If Tony needed to stay after hours to meet with the other doctors, he wanted to be there. That's incredibly weird for a spouse to sit in on official meetings with employees. I don't think I need to go over that too much. It's weird. Tony also started staying at work a little later and a little later, and she wasn't there doing work. She was picking out furniture, playing on the computer. The people she worked with really felt like she was just trying not to go home, which is so incredibly sad. She had wanted to have a daughter so much, and I can only think that she didn't want to go home because not having a kid, I think, was really painful for her. She really wanted a child, but now having a child and not being allowed to be involved with them, any aspect of raising them, has got to be infinitely more painful. As a mom, I feel for her so much. I literally can't imagine what that's like, but it must have been terrible. So Tony's Mr. Perfect, not so perfect after all. So it was a little bit of a surprise when Harold called up Tony's office to talk to the office manager and ask her to help him plan something. He wanted to surprise Tony with a weekend getaway in the mountains for their 12th anniversary. And the office manager at the time recalls thinking, wow, what a nice thing to do. Maybe this guy isn't so bad after all. Spoiler alert, he is so bad. But his little scheme was that the office manager would fill up Tony's books for that following Friday so that she didn't have any appointments in the afternoon, but it would look like she had appointments. So that way she could leave work early and they could head on their vacation. He also had them sneak him into one of the exam rooms without Tony noticing, so she thought there was a patient in there. So when she opens the door to see her patient, there's her husband standing there, and boy does she look surprised. I've seen video of this because the people in the office were filming it on their phones. She looks surprised. She does not look particularly happy, I noted. She's got that forced happy, oh, so great. But her eyes are dead. In my opinion, she very much looks like she did not want to be seeing her husband just then, and probably did not really want to go away for a whole weekend alone with him. But again, that's just my opinion. So anyway, his little plan went off without a hitch, and that very afternoon, Harold and Dr. Henthorn headed off for their romantic anniversary trip to Rocky Mountain National Park. He had booked a room for them in the Stanley Hotel. And I don't know if you've heard about the Stanley Hotel. It's famous. Let me tell you about it. It is a sprawling 142-room historic resort in Estes Park, Colorado, built in 1909. Famous horror writer Stephen King, have you heard of him? I bet you have. Well, he and his wife stayed there one night back in the 1970s. His stay in the Stanley Hotel inspired him to write one of his best-selling novels, The Shining. Yes, that is correct. Harold was taking his wife to stay in a hotel that very famously inspired the Overlook Hotel in the book The Shining, a story about a man who goes crazy and kills his wife and child. This, kids, is what we call foreshadowing. Do you think he knew? Do you think he knew about the Stanley Hotel? I think he did. I think he did it on purpose because he's a complete wackadoodle. So the next day, on September 29th, the couple heads out for a nice long hike on Deer Mountain. It is a 6-mile round trip at an elevation of about 10,000 feet over incredibly rugged terrain. And they had planned to be back in time for dinner reservations at 7 p.m., but neither of them would make it to the restaurant that night. Around 6 p.m. that evening, instead of heading to a fancy anniversary dinner, Harold was calling emergency medical services to come and rescue his wife, who he said was barely clinging to life after taking a fall off of a cliff. So they were already on fairly treacherous terrain. This was a pretty difficult hike, but they had gone off trail into even more dangerous territory down the side of the mountain. And because of the dangerous and difficult terrain and the somewhat remote area they were in, it was going to take a little while for help to arrive. So as Harold is talking to the emergency dispatch, he says she is breathing, her heart is beating, and he talks to multiple people about Tony's condition, and he tells them different things at different times, so the timeline is a little bit fuzzy. But what he tells the dispatcher is that they need help, but she is breathing. Eventually he tells the dispatcher that she has stopped breathing. So at this point, they try to walk him through doing CPR. But Harold keeps disconnecting the call. He says he's running low on cell phone battery, but he did find time in between calls to dispatch to text Tony's older brother, Barry, remember, the cardiologist, and let him know that there had been a terrible accident, and he's just sort of constantly keeping him updated. So Barry, of course, being a cardiologist, wants to know how her heartbeat and respiration are. So he asks these questions, and Harold gives him answers, and he's sort of trying to help as much as he can. But remember, he's in Mississippi and they're in Denver, so there's just not that much he can do other than try to use his medical knowledge to help coach his sister's husband on how to keep her alive. So by the time the EMT ranger comes and gets finally to their location, Tony is dead. Harold informs Barry, the brother, of Tony's passing in a text message, which, first of all, rude. But now, of course, Barry is tasked with the crushing job of informing their parents that their daughter has died at just 50 years old, the victim of a tragic hiking accident. And what were her father's first words upon hearing of her unfortunate fall? He pushed her. From moment one, there was no doubt in the minds of Tony's family that her tragic demise was not the result of misadventure, but was in fact a calculated homicide by her sketchy-ass husband. And they didn't even know the half of how completely wackadoodle this guy was. But they would find out shortly, because they were not the only ones who thought that the circumstances of Tony's death were a little bit suspicious. To the park ranger on scene, Harold's demeanor and Tony's condition were ringing some serious alarm bells. And those alarm bells got a lot louder when investigators found out about another accidental death connected to Harold Henthorn. That of the first Mrs. Henthorn. Yes, that's right, Harold had been married before. Now, Tony and her family knew that he was a widower, and he had told them that his previous wife had died in a terrible car accident. And truth be told, at the time that it happened, that's what the coroner determined as well. His first wife was named Lynn, and in light of this second wife that has passed in a terrible accident, investigators decided to dig a little deeper into Lynn Henthorn's death. They found quite a few details that raised some eyebrows. So although the accident did involve a vehicle, it was not a vehicle collision as Harold had led people to believe. Lynn had been crushed under the wheel hub of the couple's Jeep, while she was, according to Harold, reaching for a lug nut that he had dropped while changing a tire. Okay, fine. Horrible things happen, and sometimes multiple horrible things happen to the same person. It's unfortunate, but sometimes people do get crushed under their car while changing a tire. But wait, there's more. Upon questioning in Lynn's case, Harold had told the authorities that they had just decided to go out on a little nighttime spur of the moment drive, just an unplanned drive up into remote parts of the mountains for fun, I guess. And they had pulled over when Harold felt that the tire was a little squishy. Not flat, just squishy, and he thought they needed to change it. He had the tire completely off the hub, and it was set up on a jack that wasn't really the right jack for that car. Because it wasn't the right jack for the car, it was too short. So they had additionally put it on a cinder block to make it taller, to give the Jeep the lift it needed in order to remove the tire. At some point during this process, a lug nut is dropped. It's not particularly clear whether Harold dropped the lug nut or if Lynn dropped the lug nut, but either way, he sent Lynn under the car after it because she was slimmer than he was and could fit under the car better. I don't know. This is his story, so some of it doesn't make that much sense. While she was under the Jeep, under the wheel hub of the Jeep, which you are never supposed to do, Harold decided to take the old tire and toss it into the back of the Jeep. He says when he did this, the momentum of him throwing this tire into the Jeep rocked the vehicle off of the jack, or the jack failed in some way, and the car landed on top of Lynn. That's not where this story ends, but I just want to say, how stupid do you have to be to take a tire and toss it into the back of your car while there's somebody under the jacked up car? In my opinion, that almost alone makes you criminally responsible in some way, because that's very dumb. Anyway, of course, even at that time, the police kind of thought it was a little weird. I might have forgotten to mention, this was back in 1995. So even back then, when this happened, the police thought it was a little bit weird. So, of course, they were looking for witnesses, etc. They did find a mechanic who had driven by the couple after they were pulled off on the side of the road and had stopped briefly to ask them if they needed help. And Harold told them that they didn't. They were just going to change the tire, and this mechanic moved on. There was another group of people that were passing by and stopped because they saw that Lynn was trapped under the car, and so they got out to try to give some assistance. And these people were very weirded out by the way that Harold was acting. First of all, they tried to get Lynn out from under the vehicle. They said Harold didn't help at all, didn't lift a finger to try to actually help his wife. It was cold outside, and he wouldn't give up his jacket to help cover his wife, who they weren't sure whether she was dead or not yet. And if she was still alive, she was certainly in shock, and they wanted to get her warm. But he did not want to be uncomfortable, so he kept his coat on himself. This Good Samaritan who had stopped to help was actually so freaked out by the way Harold was acting that she called the police station the next day and asked, "Have you arrested the husband yet?" And the couple of points that are maybe the most important to what we're talking about here, when the authorities investigating Tony's death were looking into all of this information, they also found in a report from Lynn's case that there had been a footprint, like a shoe print, found on the front bumper of the Jeep that Lynn was crushed by that was never explained. And also, the police at the time, of course, had asked Harold about things like life insurance, etc., and he had told them that Lynn had a $300,000 life insurance policy. What the investigators of Tony's case found when they were digging back into these files is that Harold had lied. He had recently changed Lynn's life insurance policy to one that would double if she died in case of an accident. And they also uncovered that back in 1995, he claimed on that doubled amount, $600,000. Regardless of all these sort of circumstantial things, Harold was never charged for Lynn's death. And I do need to mention that, because if I do say anything regarding that situation going forth in this video, just know that it's all my opinion and alleged. Of course, because he was never charged or convicted of killing his first wife. But when you have one wife that dies in a horrible, painful, brutal accident, that's unfortunate and sad. But when you have two wives that die in horrible, tragic, painful, brutal accidents, that's a pattern. And as the investigators in Tony's case talked to Tony's family, friends, and coworkers, they learned of their suspicions. Particularly from her brothers and parents, they learned of an incident that had happened just 1 year prior to when she was killed at a little vacation cabin that Harold owned. They had gone there for the weekend with their daughter, and after their daughter was in bed and asleep in the middle of the night, for some reason, Harold had decided that he needed to go do some work on the roof. It doesn't seem to be very specific about what he was doing on the roof, but he needed to be up there in the middle of the night for some reason. And while he was up there, he called for Tony to come out to help him with something. As soon as Tony walked out onto the deck of this cabin, she saw something on the ground, bent over to pick it up, and as she did, she felt something hit her on the back of the neck. What had hit her was a large piece of lumber, like a 2x4. Tony had to go to the hospital for this. She had a fractured vertebrae. It knocked her out. Part of her body went numb. She had a little bit of missing feeling in her fingers even after she had surgery to correct this. And as you can imagine, for somebody who's an ophthalmologist who does eye surgery, having any loss of feelings in your hands or fingers can be career-ending. This was a very, very serious injury, and Harold didn't even tell her parents about it. They didn't find out until months later when they were talking to Tony and she mentioned the accident, and they said, well, what happened? We had no idea about this. Tony had just assumed that Harold had informed them. And when they confronted Harold about this, he acted like it was no big deal. He was like, oh yeah, she, got a little bit hurt. Something fell on her. But this was a really traumatic injury. Sometime after that incident, Tony was actually able to take a rare trip to see her parents in Mississippi without Harold. Usually if they went to visit Tony's family, it was pretty rare that they would go down there anyway, but almost always Harold had to be there with them because he's a control freak. And Mrs. Bertolet, Tony's mother, used this opportunity when Tony was there alone to discuss openly with her the concerns about her son-in-law. By the end of that conversation, in which Tony didn't really speak much, Mrs. Bertolet said, "You do what you want, but if I were you, I would not be alone with that man." They were all quite convinced that Harold had injured Tony on purpose, throwing something down on her from the roof at that cabin. The injury to the back of her neck was so bad, and it only happened to the back of her neck because she had bent down to pick something up. If she hadn't bent over, it would have hit her right on the top of her head and may very well have killed her. They all pretty much thought that that was Harold's plan. The family also talked to the police about their concerns regarding this trip that the couple had been on in the first place. Now, staying at a hotel, having some leisurely hikes up in the Rocky Mountains, not a big deal, but these two people were in their 50s. Tony had had multiple knee surgeries, and so the idea that she would want to go on this very long, very rugged and strenuous hike was ridiculous to them. Tony's knees were simply not good enough that she would have wanted to make a 6-mile journey over rugged terrain. So obviously all of these circumstances and Harold's general behavior are all looking pretty bad for him. But what investigators really needed was some kind of motive. Why would he have wanted to kill his wife? They didn't have to look very hard to find that motive. 4.7 million motives, because that's exactly the amount of dollars Harold stood to gain after Tony's passing. Some of that money was going to come from a trust fund that was actually set up in their daughter's name that Harold had recently forged Tony's signature to have transferred to him as the beneficiary instead. And the rest of it was from multiple million or so dollar life insurance policies that he had taken out on Tony without her knowledge. Obviously, they question him, right? You got to bring him in. You got to talk to him about it. But old Harold could not keep his story straight on how exactly Tony ended up falling. He says he didn't hear her. He didn't hear her fall. He didn't hear her scream. He just looked over and she was gone. At one point he said, well, he was looking at his phone and she was looking at her phone, and then he looked up from his phone and she was gone. At one point, he said he was setting up the camera so that he could get a picture of them on the edge of the cliff, and she fell while his back was turned. And in another story, she had gone to the edge of the cliff with her camera because they saw some wild turkeys, and she wanted to get as close as she could to get a picture of them. There's two things wrong with this story. Number one, Toni's camera was there. It was sitting close to her body when the ranger came upon the scene, and it was not in any way damaged or destroyed. She fell 140 feet off the side of this cliff. If she had been having her camera in her hands, even if it was on a lanyard around her neck or something like that, and she fell with that camera's destroyed. Okay, but the camera that they recovered didn't have a scratch on it, so she definitely wasn't taking pictures of turkeys. And the ranger also confronted Harold on this story because he was like, we're 10,000 feet up. There's no wild turkeys at this elevation. At that point, Harold said, oh, well, maybe it was deer or something. Harold, the only turkey here is you. So all in all, the circumstances of this accident have investigators thinking that Harold looks pretty good for murder. But in order to prove murder over, let's say, manslaughter or some other lesser charge, you have to show solid evidence of premeditation, right? That's what murder is. We've talked about that before. That's part of the necessary component of murder. If only the police had found a map of the area where Harold had highlighted the trail they were going to take, highlighted the area where they were going to go off the trail with a big X drawn right over the spot where he pushed his wife off a cliff. Oh wait, they did have that. They found it in his car. What an absolute asshat this guy is. And on top of that, despite Harold's insistence that he had only been around this trail one time in the past, he was very unfamiliar with it, his cell phone records indicated that in recent weeks, he had visited that exact spot 9 times. He was literally scoping the place out, walking all over that ridge, trying to find the perfect place. But with as busy as he was at work, where could he possibly have found all of this time to sneak away into the mountains without his wife noticing he was gone? Well, remember how I said that Harold was a work from home, except for these business trips that he needed to take for his company that did fundraising for nonprofits? The one he told Toni and his family made him millions of dollars every year? Okay, bear with me here. Everyone had already pretty much figured out that he was not making as much money as he claimed, right? They were not living the life of a man who makes millions of dollars every year. But it gets so much worse. Investigators found out that not only was this fundraising company a complete sham, okay, did not exist, but Harold had not had a job or an income in 20 years. That's before the first Mrs. Henthorn was accidented under a car. So at this point, the police are diving deep into this couple's finances. And what they found led them to believe that Toni herself may have been getting a little bit wise to Harold's BS. Everything that this couple had the whole time they were married was all in joint accounts. But just shortly before she was killed, Toni had opened an account in her own name that Harold did not have access to. Now remember, I said that Toni's family was very wealthy from oil money. So because of all this oil money, Toni had a trust that was connected to oil. So basically, she would just get cut a check every month that was on the low end, $2,000 or $3,000, and on the high end, $25,000 every single month that was given to her as part of her family's trust. And that's what she was doing with this account. She was having all of her oil money rerouted from the joint bank account to this private account. Harold was the only one who was allowed to be in control of the couple's finances. And I have to assume that because he's such a nitty-gritty control freak, that he had a pretty good idea about what was in those accounts at all times, what was expected to come in and what was expected to go out. He had to have noticed that the monthly trust checks weren't coming in. Could he have noticed this and confronted Toni about it? Maybe. Could he have realized that he was losing his influence on his meal ticket and decided it was time to cash out and move on? Probably. As a matter of fact, I think that's exactly what happened. And although that is just my opinion, I feel comfortable saying that. Because at the end of 2015, 3 years after Toni Henthorn was pushed off a 140-foot cliff to her death, a jury of his peers convicted Harold "Stupid" Henthorn of the murder of his wife, and he was sentenced to life in federal prison. Now, of course, there were appeals, and his lawyers, who, I might add, during the trial, the defense didn't call a single witness. And I have to assume that that's mostly because there was nobody who wanted to defend this guy, right? Who are they going to get up there to talk about how he didn't do this? Everybody thought he did. Anyway, upon appeal, the defense was trying to get him a new trial because the judge in his case had allowed the prosecution to bring into evidence the weird circumstances of Lynn Henthorn's death. But that didn't really fly. A federal appeals court struck it down, and the Supreme Court didn't even want to hear it. So, he's done, and he's never getting out. Now, that is more or less the end of the story. But before I go, I wanted to drop in one little tidbit that I learned about that I couldn't really figure out a way to fit it into the rest of this story, but it's just so heartbreaking and sad. Remember Tony's brother Barry, the cardiologist? It turns out that some years before, he had been demonstrating and testing out some kind of CT scanner or something like that, and was using his sister's husband, Harold, as just kind of a model, somebody to put in there to look at. And while they were running this demonstration, Barry saw that Harold's heart was clogged up, like about to have a heart attack any minute. And so Barry got him into surgery, did some bypass, got his arteries all cleared out, and saved his life. If Tony's brother hadn't saved his life, there's a really good possibility that Harold Henthorn would have dropped dead of a heart attack before he ever got the chance to kill Tony. Had Barry Bertolette been able to see the future, maybe he would have kept his lip tight about those clogged arteries. That's all I have for you today. Thank you again so much for joining me today. I hope you found this story interesting. Please take some time to take care of yourself today and every day. I have to remind myself of that constantly. I don't always do it. I'm trying to get better. We'll work on it together. Hit the like button if you liked this video, and if you haven't yet, hit the subscribe button and join us again sometime. And until then, bye!